Welcome to the Situation Room. This week we're going to touch down first in the United States of America, where the nation's military-industrial complex has created perhaps the most advanced fighter aircraft in human history. Then we'll turn to America's great adversary, China, to explore a new naval development that bridges the gap between China's practical capabilities and its ambitions to invade Taiwan. And after China, we'll turn to the military island of Diego Garcia, where a growing collection of highly advanced bomber aircraft seems to suggest a storm is coming. And finally, we'll examine the situation in East Africa, where just in the days since our prior episode, a major regional war has gone from likely to imminent. If there's a certain item that's caught your attention, we got timestamps below. That's a new thing, you're welcome. But we strongly recommend that you, of course, listen to the full story. It's good for you, and it's good for our analytics. Let's get into it. The United States Air Force has defined the bleeding edge of military aviation for 3/4 of a century. And on Friday, March the 21st, 2025, America moved to extend that legacy for decades to come. On that day, the White House unveiled an aircraft formerly known as the NGAD, the Next Generation Air Dominance Fighter Jet. But now it's known as the F-47. Bearing a name that appears to directly honor and reference America's 47th president, who proudly unveiled it alongside his Secretary of Defense and Air Force leadership, the F-47 is what's known as a sixth-generation fighter jet. And look, really, if you want to be technical about it, a sixth-generation fighter jet is an arbitrary term with no clear definition, but generally sixth-gen warplanes are expected to be highly stealthy, to integrate artificial intelligence and other advanced digital capabilities, and to integrate the most modern engines and weapons, potentially including directed energy weapons. No world nation is currently known to have a sixth-generation aircraft in service, although several ongoing programs across the globe are trying to make that happen. Two other highly esteemed American warplanes, the stealth fighters F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning, are referred to as fifth-generation fighters, alongside only China's J-20, debatably Russia's Su-57, and an upcoming Turkish jet known as the Khan. A sixth-generation fighter like the F-47 should offer head and shoulders superiority over any of them. The fighter's exact specifications are not yet known with any confidence. Sadly, Pete Hegseth didn't DM us. However, through a mix of previous reporting, promotional materials released when the F-47 was made public, and various expert analyses, we can explain at least some of the aircraft's capabilities. The F-47 is an air superiority fighter meant to replace the highly formidable but increasingly obsolete F-22 Raptor in America's arsenal. It is expected to boast speeds of at least twice the speed of sound, that's 1,535 miles an hour or 2,470 kilometers per hour, and it appears to be designed, at least partially, as a highly maneuverable platform. In contrast to prior depictions of what a sixth-generation fighter jet might look like, an artist's conception presented by the White House during the F-47's unveiling showed the jet with little winglets, known as canards, set close to the cockpit and in front of the aircraft's upward-sloping main wings. That is a particularly meaningful change, since it's long been believed that a combination of stealth, speed, endurance, sensor technology, and long-range weaponry would make close-quarters maneuverability irrelevant for a sixth-generation jet, something that the F-47's design apparently appear to dispute. Also in dispute is the idea that those canards make it more difficult to evade detection, a claim that's been hotly debated for over a decade, but that the F-47's creators don't appear to buy into. The aircraft is thought to be tailless, and it will have space for a pilot, although it may be optionally manned rather than manned by necessity. Under the hood, the F-47 will boast, quote, significantly longer range, more advanced stealth, be more sustainable, supportable, and have higher availability than our fifth-generation fighters. That's according to Air Force Chief of Staff and General David Alvin. Cutting-edge stealth features are especially important for fighter jets like this, as evolutions in sensor technology have made planes like the Raptor and the Lightning less stealthy over time than when they were first designed, and it's likely that the F-47 will reduce infrared signatures, project false radar signatures, and otherwise disguise what will be a tiny radar cross-section. Accomplish that, and the F-47 will return to America a stealth advantage that was never truly compromised, but had been waning year after year. The F-47's prioritization of long-range capabilities is critical as well, since a stealth fighter that can fly longer and further reduces its need for air-to-air refueling. The Air Force appears as if it's about to end a program that would have created a stealthy refueling tanker, which in turn could have escorted 6th-generation aircraft with a shorter range into hostile environments undetected. But an F-47 that can handle long-range missions by itself negates the need for a stealthy tanker aircraft and thus saves the Pentagon some desperately needed billions. Finally, on the subject of supportability and availability, the F-47 is expected to be designed in a modular way, with components that can be swapped and upgraded without having to redo the entire fighter jet, while spending a higher proportion of its time mission-ready than the aircraft in America's arsenal. Other elements of the aircraft's design, they're less clear. The armaments it can carry, for example, or its payload capacity inside an internal weapons bay are unknown, as are the specifics of its range, its endurance, or even its size. The aircraft is expected to be able to act as the leader of a sort of digital hive mind during battles. But the specifics of that technology, not yet clear. It's expected to fly alongside loyal wingmen drones, and there are known drone designs to fit that purpose, but the drones it'll ultimately fly alongside haven't yet been chosen, and their capabilities are unclear. The capabilities of its engines, the presence or lack of directed energy weapons, and its ability to interfere with, jam, or otherwise interact with enemy targeting systems, all currently unknown. On the more superficial side, the fighter jet doesn't yet have a name, although we imagine it'll be something really, really cool and futuristic sounding. Its official designation, F-47, is meant to honor a World War II aircraft, the P-47, and the Air Force's founding year of 1947, as well as what the Air Force described as, quote, the 47th President's pivotal support for the development of the world's first 6th-generation fighter. Just as notable as the formal announcement of the F-47 to the world is the announcement of the organization that's going to build it. That would be the Boeing Company, a true giant of the aviation industry and a defense contractor responsible for America's F-15 Eagle, F-A-18 Super Hornet, and all manner of airlifters, tankers, and drones. It's also a company that's fallen on hard times recently, largely of its own making, from safety issues on its commercial aircraft to production shortfalls to the embarrassing and drawn-out debacle that was the first launch of Boeing's Starliner spacecraft. For Boeing, reportedly facing a loss of confidence, even from its own employees and from both sides of the American legislative aisle, a contract to build something as advanced and high priority as the F-47 is a hell of a lifeline. At the same time, the choice of Boeing to produce the F-47 has generated more than a little skepticism among industry experts. They note not just Boeing's recent troubles, but the fact that the F-47 will be Boeing's first time designing a fighter jet from scratch since it merged with McDonnell Douglas nearly 3 decades ago. Before it was chosen, Boeing was in competition with Lockheed Martin to secure the 6th-generation fighter contract, and there's a fair argument that Lockheed Martin, responsible for both the F-35 and the F-22 as Lockheed Corporation, are the more proven and reliable choice for this specific project. Granted, other leading aerospace voices have argued that a bit of diversification is a good thing. But the program to build the world's most advanced fighter jet may not be the best time to roll the dice on Boeing. By some accounts, Boeing's situation is so dire that this contract will save the company's entire defense branch. Now that the design and the manufacturer have been chosen, the next step is for the US Air Force to go about procuring the F-47 and ultimately introducing it to service. There's no public estimate on price yet because, quoting Donald Trump here, it would give away some of the technology and some of the size of the plane. It is, however, described as being cheaper than either the F-22 or the F-35. The per-unit procurement cost of the F-22, calculated as an average back in 2010, was nearly $186 million, which is $272 million in today's money, whereas the F-35A's per-unit cost comes in at about $100 million apiece. The price of actually sustaining those programs, calculated per plane, is considerably higher, but that's not what we're talking about here. Previous conversations on the NGAD prior to the start of Trump's term indicated that a single plane could cost 3 times what an F-35 does, and it's not clear where the cost reductions are coming from. On timeline, the hope is for an F-47 production model, not the X-planes and demonstrators that have already been flown, to take its first flight by the time Trump finishes his second term as president in early 2029. One potential sticking point may be the F-47's engine, which is yet to be chosen and is expected to be a highly advanced and profoundly complex piece of equipment. Notably, the Air Force has indicated that it intends to procure the aircraft in large numbers, in contrast to prior descriptions of the NGAD program, where numbers between 200 and 250 aircraft were typically passed around. And in yet another contradiction of prior reports, the F-47 is purportedly under consideration as an export product to foreign nations, perhaps those pathetic European freeloaders who've recently attracted Pete Hegseth's ire. Boeing has recently invested in a manufacturing center that measures over 1 million square feet, expected to open next year and support production of advanced aircraft. And, well, that's likely where the F-47 is going to be built. It is a major victory for the United States to be publicly unveiling any details about the next generation air dominance fighter, let alone a designation and a manufacturer. It's also a notable reversal for the program, where just a few months ago it was an open question whether the NGAD would even move forward. Starting in the summer of 2024, the Air Force embarked on a full review of the program to examine whether it would even be useful in a couple of decades' time. The turnaround from then to now has been stark to behold, with the Air Force confirming the need for the NGAD just a couple of months ago. One likely reason for the rush, however, is a development we actually covered here on WarFronts just a couple of months ago. In December 2024, China revealed not just one, but two seemingly advanced aircraft that were undergoing flight tests, one of which was described as the world's first sixth-generation jet fighter. Those Chinese aircraft seem to have been top of mind for the Air Force, with Chief of Staff Alvin declaring at the F-47 announcement, quoting here, "Despite what our adversaries claim, the F-47 is truly the world's first crewed sixth-generation fighter built to dominate the most capable peer adversary and operate in the most perilous threat environments imaginable." Nor is the F-47 the only advanced fighter jet that's about to be revealed to the world. Just days after the F-47 was unveiled, reports circulated via Reuters that the US Navy will announce the aircraft it will adopt as part of its own program, the F/A-XX. The same journalist breaking this story was the one first revealed that an Air Force announcement was imminent just before that announcement was made. By the time this episode goes out, the Navy's carrier-based sixth-generation fighter may have already been announced. Boeing is also believed to be one of the final candidates in that competition alongside Northrop Grumman. The latter company may have a higher chance of success, given both the desire not to have Boeing splitting its time between two aircraft and Northrop Grumman's greater experience with carrier-based craft. Not to mention, in the event of catastrophe with Boeing's F-47, it's somewhat easier to take a carrier-based aircraft and adjust it for land-based service than to do the inverse. And around the world, the announcement of the F-47 may prompt the reveal of other next-generation aircraft. China is known to be flying an advanced tailless aircraft that appears to be designated the J-36, but it hasn't been formally announced at the time of writing, something that Beijing could rectify if it wants to reclaim headlines in this area. A trilateral project between Japan, Italy, and the UK, known as the Global Combat Air Programme, is entering a development phase this year and should fly a sixth-gen technology demonstrator aircraft by 2027. France, Germany, and Spain have their own initiative, the New Generation Fighter, under their shared Future Combat Air System, also with the expectation that a technology demonstrator will fly in 2027. Other nations, including Russia and Brazil, have each indicated the desire to embark on sixth-generation projects, although neither nation appears as if they're far enough along to even estimate when a test flight could happen. For now, however, it's the United States still out of the pack, and it's the F-47 that will allow America to keep or even extend its competitive lead. It has been a big month for global superpowers acquiring new toys, and in China, the new toy revealed in the last few weeks has come by sea. Its name is the Shu Kao, and it's a barge that will allow China to land tank after tank after tank on enemy soil in a potential invasion of Taiwan. The Western world first became aware of the Shu Kao, at least in the public domain, back in early January of this year. At that time, a prominent naval expert that we've referenced numerous times here on The Situation Room, H.I. Sutton, published a report via the outlet Naval News and revealed that China was adding a new ship to its fleet. Wrote Sutton in that report, quoting him directly here, "China is building at least 5 new special-purpose barges which appear tailor-made for amphibious assault." According to several sources, China was building a number of unusual craft that shared one notable feature above all the rest. They featured exceptionally long bridges, seemingly road bridges that extended from the bow or front of each vessel. According to initial analysis, the road span observed at the front of the barges stretched for over 120 meters or 393 feet, long enough, quoting Sutton here, to reach a coastal road or hard surface beyond a beach. That is to say, a soldier or an armored vehicle or even a tank that's being transported aboard such a barge could travel across its road bridge, skip the mess and complication of a beach landing entirely, and travel onto surfaces with far better traction for ground operations. Not only that, but the barges had another strange feature: massive pillars that could be lowered into the ground and stabilize the barges on the seabed, ensuring that they'd be secure in bad weather or other harsh conditions. The intent of the ship was clear as soon as it was even somewhat scrutinized. It was a tool by which Beijing could launch an invasion of Taiwan, bringing the full power of its land army to bear. The addition of this strange ship to China's arsenal is a major development for Beijing, owing largely to the fact that compared to the rest of China's navy and non-naval war vessels, its supply of landing craft has long seemed like a weakness. The nation only has a handful of large amphibious assault ships, the sort of ships that could deposit hundreds or thousands of Chinese Marines onto Taiwanese shores, and that's been a major problem. After all, China could leverage an army 100 times bigger than Taiwan's, but if it can only land a few thousand ships of its troops at a time, then Taiwan is at an advantage in battle unless the rest of China's soldiers are really strong swimmers. For those landing barges to be implemented during an invasion, well, that would be a massive shift of China's fortunes during such a conflict. The location where the barges are being built would seem to confirm that they're for a new and unique purpose. That location, Guangzhou Shipyard, is known for churning out unusual or specialty ships for various purposes. And not only that, but sources on the ground indicate, again, according to Naval News, that the project is moving real fast. Then, just a few days ago at the time of writing, China decided to show its new barges to the entire world. On the 20th of January, a 19-second clip emerged on Chinese social media from a public beach, showing not just one, but an entire line of the landing barges just off the seashore. One barge was parked close enough to land that it could extend its bridge over and past the waterline, while the barge behind it attached its own road bridge to the barge leading the line, and so on, and so on. Altogether, the ships extended more than a kilometer into the sea, reaching sufficient depths for even the highest displacement, deepest draft ships to come in and make contact. The video was quickly taken down, but not before it was circulated by Western media. Notably, China's quickness in censoring the video suggests that despite the placement of the landing ships near a public beach, China did want to keep its operations away from prying eyes. That's in sharp contrast to the purportedly sixth-generation fighter aircraft China revealed back in December, when it gave no formal acknowledgement but allowed video to circulate unchecked on social media. Now, tactically, these barges are so notable not just because they can place infantry, tanks, and armored vehicles onto enemy soil, but because they're a sort of force multiplier. Unlike China's existing assault ships, and unlike the vast majority of amphibious naval assets in any nation's possession, these barges appear optimized to receive tanks and vehicles that have been transported aboard other ships, and then drive those vehicles from the ship that transported them over the barge and down the ramp. What that means is that China no longer has to rely exclusively on ships that can push troops onto a beachhead. Instead, it can rely on open water vessels that couldn't handle being run aground, but that have more than enough carrying capacity and the right internal setup to carry equipment. And as it happens, China has precisely that sort of ship in massive numbers by way of Beijing's civilian ferries. Now, to understand just what sort of ship we're talking about here, let's look at a roll-on, roll-off ferry that turned up as part of an amphibious assault exercise all the way back in 2019. That ship, referred to as the Bangqiu Dao, is a really large craft, displacing 15,560 metric tons of water. For reference, that's about double the displacement of a fully loaded Arleigh Burke-class US naval destroyer. It's 134 meters long, 23 meters across, and it's capable of carrying hundreds of cars and thousands of people on an average day of operations. The trick, however, is that it's a dual-use craft with decks that are built to support the weight of a full ship's worth of main battle tanks, and it's been tested for precisely that purpose during naval exercises. The Bangqiu Dao isn't the only ferry like this. China has hundreds, and all of them are built for precisely these sorts of dual-use operations. Said Navy researcher Dr. Emma Salisbury in a conversation with Naval News back in January, quoting here, "China is constructing a huge fleet of dual-use ships, commercial vessels that could be easily requisitioned for military use when needed." End quote. The intended utility of those ships hasn't always been obvious because there's always been this missing piece in the connective chain China would use to get the tanks onto enemy soil. Load them up onto ferries, bring them close to Taiwan, and, well, then what? Wait for an assault force to establish such complete control of a beachhead that they can construct the facilities to get these tanks off the ferries? As it turns out, well, no. China could just pull the ferries up next to these new landing barges, and the barges are going to take care of the rest. As for how they'd actually be used in combat, analysts and experts have noted a number of potential challenges. The ships would be stationary while offloading tanks to a beachhead, and they'd be vulnerable to attacks from missiles, drones, and other threats presented by the Taiwanese military or its allies. That problem is made worse when it's paired with the fact that fewer than 20 Taiwanese beaches are thought to be suitable for amphibious assault, meaning that Taiwan can better mass its forces, concentrate fire, and get rid of those ships if they were to show up. It's unlikely, however, that these ships would be headed into the heat of battle. As we've mentioned before, China would have a hard time taking over Taiwan with just the forces that it can put onto Taiwanese beaches with its amphibious assault ships. Those ships are, however, probably enough to complete the early phase of landing, where Marines would come ashore en masse and clear out the immediate area into a secure beachhead. That's especially true because tactically it would benefit Taiwanese forces to let China have those landing zones, but then spread their forces thin or take them into more fortified inland areas where they can be dealt with more easily. These new ships, however, turn that equation on its head. Now, by pulling back somewhat and letting an amphibious assault force deal with mines, traps, and a slowly retreating Taiwanese force, Taiwan risks giving up an area where these ships could offload entire divisions of the Chinese army onto their soil. Repelling an invasion under those circumstances would be exponentially more difficult. The other angle to consider is timing. As we mentioned earlier, China can produce these ships fast, potentially on timelines as few as 4 months, according to Jason Wang, the leader of a geospatial analysis company who spoke to The Guardian about the barges. That's already important, simply on the basis that China can produce the ships fast. But that's not the worst part. China knows that introducing these ships will force Taiwan to recalibrate its battle plans. So if China does seriously intend to invade, then it would be to China's advantage to ensure that Taiwan has as little time to shift and prepare as possible. Move fast enough, and China could have its ships ready to go before Taiwan acquires appropriate weapons or before it shifts its fortifications. What that means is that it would be to China's advantage to wait and wait and wait until the very last possible moment to position its materials and its workers, but show no sign of a finished product until they had to. And then, once that starting gun kicks off, build and build and build as fast as China's laborers possibly can, and then invade ASAP. Nobody except Beijing knows what China's magic number will be. Nobody knows what the critical mass of landing barges really is for China before the nation's generals and admirals have what they need and Xi Jinping can sign off on an order to commence invasion. But if China did wait to reveal these ships and is now in the early months of a breakout period to build whatever it can, then that should be taken as an ominous warning sign that China's timeline has accelerated. Conversely, if these ships are being built at a more leisurely pace, then that may be a more positive indicator. But there's a difference between these ships being built as fast as possible, being built at a comfortable pace, or finally being built as fast as possible without arousing suspicion. In the coming months, it'll be incumbent on Taiwan and its allies to figure out just how fast China is straining to churn these ships out, because the harder China is working, the sooner an invasion of Taiwan could begin. Something strange is going on in the Indian Ocean. On the remote island of Diego Garcia, transformed decades ago by the United States into a secretive and mission-critical military base, America's most dangerous stealth bombers are gathering in unprecedented numbers. Their purpose for now is unknown, but it's clear that something major is on the horizon. Before we get into the details, a word on timing. For reasons that we're about to explain, we're not entirely confident that the situation in the Middle East will remain stable from now until the time this episode is published. As such, this episode's up to date as of midday, Thursday, March 27th on the American East Coast, where the authorities in Washington, D.C. will decide what comes next. Anything that's happened after that time will not be accounted for in today's episode, as unfortunately, we've not yet been added to the group chat to discuss whatever's happening here. It's disappointing. We keep checking. But if all goes the way it might, rest assured that we will be back to discuss it soon. The first indicator that something unusual is happening on Diego Garcia came from an open source intelligence specialist on X under the name IntelFrog. Typically, IntelFrog uses publicly available tracking data to watch US and other military aircraft as they move about the world. And over the last several days, our good frog friend began to observe several kinds of US aircraft operating strangely. First, several of America's strategic airlifters, its C-17 Globemasters, arrived to Diego Garcia around the same time, in what the UK Defence Journal referred to as, quote, a substantial logistics effort, likely involving the delivery of personnel, munitions, and support equipment required for long-range bomber operations. Then, 18 of America's KC-135 air-to-air refueling tankers started to make their way toward Diego Garcia from where they'd been previously stationed at strategically significant locations all around the Pacific Ocean. And finally, probably following behind and relying on fuel from those tankers, America's most formidable combat aircraft began arriving on scene. The B-2 Spirit is perhaps the most impressive aircraft ever to enter military service for any nation on the merits of its capability and technology. Absolutely massive, with the ability to carry somewhere around 23 metric tons of ordnance for ranges of up to 11,000 kilometers, the B-2 is exceptionally stealthy and it's capable of delivering conventional or nuclear hell on targets just about anywhere in the world. It's also a very rare aircraft, with only 19 B-2s in total in US service. So, when 7 of those incredibly valuable, incredibly formidable aircraft all show up in the same spot, something's up. And according to satellite imagery, flight logs, and more, at least 7 B-2s are now thought to be on Diego Garcia right now. For them to be accompanied by such a substantial logistical chain in the form of tankers and airlifters indicates that they're not just going to be used for a one-off operation, but that the US military is planning something that requires their flexibility, their operational versatility, and their sustainment for longer-term operations. Put simply, something big's coming, or at least we think it is. The first question to ask at this stage is to try and figure out what those bomber aircraft could be used to hit. The obvious answer, in close enough range to Diego Garcia that an operation based on the island would make sense, is Yemen, where the Houthi rebel organization has recently attracted the ire of Donald Trump and his allies. Since March the 1st, American warplanes have laid waste to targets in Yemen, fist emoji, flag emoji, fire emoji, and those airstrikes don't appear to be stopping anytime soon. But although the Houthis are known to be on Uncle Sam's radar, both literally and metaphorically, the deployment of 7 B-2 bombers to deal with them would be a little bit much. In fact, we actually spoke about a US airstrike here on the Situation Room back in October of last year because it marked the first time that a B-2 Spirit had been used against the Houthis at all. Back then, the use of 2 B-2s in a single airstrike was already overkill, fist emoji, flag emoji, fire emoji, to deal with the threat posed by the Houthis, and they were leveraged more as a show of military might than anything else, especially since they appeared to be dropping ordnance that other, less expensive American bombers and fighter jets are perfectly capable of carrying. When in 2022, the US deployed 4 B-2s to Australia, or when in 2020, America sent 6 much older and decidedly unstealthy B-52s to Diego Garcia, those were taken as major signals to deter China and Iran, respectively. For the US to now be deploying 7 B-2s just to deal with the Houthis, fist emoji, flag emoji, fire emoji, would be overkill stacked on overkill stacked on overkill. But the Houthis aren't the only target within striking distance of Diego Garcia, and US President J.D. Vance seems to be sick of, quote, bailing Europe out with Houthi strikes anyway. The other target worth watching is the nation of Iran. There, a brief attempt to engage on a new nuclear deal has gone sour, and quite quickly, amidst what appears to be a closing window for de-escalation. The US and Iran have both been flexing their militaries recently, Iran with Russia and China, while the US has run large drills alongside Israel. The US has moved a second carrier strike group to the Middle East while extending the deployment of the carrier group already positioned there and started beefing up its numbers of F-35 stealth fighters all across its bases in the Middle East. On the other side, Iran has issued threats by way of newly revealed underground missile silos. Trump's maximum pressure approach to Iran is making a comeback, and Trump has repeatedly called on Iran to control and rein in the Houthi rebels, although it's become increasingly clear that Iran only has so much ability to actually control them. At the same time, the United States and Iran both understand that Iran is a somewhat vulnerable target right now after massive Israeli airstrikes in 2024 devastated Iran's air defense assets across the country. Iran still has some advanced air defense systems left, meaning that the US would be wise to use stealth aircraft like the B-2, but those systems can only protect a portion of the country. Recent intelligence indicates that they've recently been repositioned toward the Strait of Hormuz, where some of Iran's most valuable military and economic targets are located. So, the writing is on the wall. The United States has positioned enough military assets in close enough proximity to Iran with enough logistical support that it could conceivably begin a long and devastating military campaign against its longtime adversary. Those assets are stationed at a place, in Diego Garcia, where Iran doesn't have the missile or drone range to hit them back, meaning that this fleet of highly stealthy aircraft can restock and refuel with impunity before embarking on missions that are decidedly within their own range with no need for air-to-air refueling. Nearby carrier strike groups could deter groups like the Houthi rebels or Hezbollah from taking any retaliatory action to avenge their international sponsor, and if the US does decide to launch airstrikes against Iran using these particular bombers, there's very little that Iran could do to stop it. If that decision is made, then America's GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs, or MOPs, would be able to burrow through and hit even the most secure and even the most vital Iranian underground targets. The B-2 is the only aircraft in America's arsenal that can drop the GBU-57, making their deployment to Diego Garcia all the more formidable. As for when those strikes could come, we've actually got a specific date in mind, and that would be Saturday, March 29th, before this episode is released. In an odd but hard-to-ignore pattern that's recently emerged, it's become clear that Donald Trump likes to do important airstrikes on Saturdays. On Saturday, February the 1st of this year, Trump launched the first known airstrikes of his presidency against Islamic State targets in Somalia. On Saturday, March the 1st, came another unusually large wave of Somali strikes. On Saturday, March 15th, the US kicked off its renewed air offensive against Yemen's Houthi rebels. To be clear, we don't know why Trump likes Saturday airstrikes so much, or why the group of advisors apparently using a Call of Duty chat to plan a Greenland invasion like Saturday airstrikes so much. We just know that they apparently do. And now, by the time this episode released, we know whether any strikes actually took place. This is what we were referring to before, when we said that if something really pops off, we'll absolutely be coming back to discuss it. But there's also another side to the coin, that this might not constitute an impending attack at all, but instead it's a show of force meant to remind Iran that it really should get in line and do as the United States says. Remember, we know all of this is happening. We're a humble little YouTube channel pulling from sources that use commercially available open source intelligence, and, well, we've been more than able to put the pieces together. Nobody here has the reach of, say, an Atlantic editor-in-chief who just happens to be one of the top contacts of America's national security advisor. And if we know this is happening, then rest assured that a nation like Iran, with its own intelligence services and the benefit of major world powers as its allies, certainly knows more about this than we do. White House staff haven't been entirely subtle about the deployment either, with White House Deputy Chief of Staff Dan Scavino conveniently decided to post a video of a B-2 bomber in flight just as news reports on the deployment were starting to emerge. So, is this deployment of B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia a warning sign, or is it a threat? At the time of writing, the verdict on that is unclear. It's entirely feasible that conversations between the United States and Iran could be ongoing as we speak, through proxies or directly, negotiating towards some sort of nuclear arrangement, an end of Iranian support to the Houthis, or who knows what. At the same time, we wouldn't be surprised at all if a US strike on Iran is old news by the time you see this episode. Either way, something big is happening at Diego Garcia, so watch carefully. And, JD, say another prayer for victory. In last week's edition, we zeroed in on the Horn of Africa and its immediate neighbours, a cluster of countries where, to our mind, it appeared like war could erupt at any moment. Well, in the mere week since we wrote that video, tensions have been cranked up by another trillion or so notches. And not just in the African Horn. Across a large swath of Eastern Africa, things seem to be converging on some sort of crisis point, a moment in which multiple wars may spill over borders and drag in surrounding countries. Some of these wars and threats of war seem to be connected, others just happen to be taking place in this geographic region. But the one thing they all have in common is the potential to drive a continent-wide catastrophe. So, this segment is going to be an overview of all these interconnected flashpoints, of all the myriad ways the region might erupt if leaders fail to turn the temperature down. Starting with those in charge of a nation that's already in crisis mode, Sudan. As we never grow tired of saying, Sudan is perhaps the most ignored major conflict on the planet. A nationwide conflagration that has probably killed over 150,000 people, reduced entire cities to rubble, and triggered both a growing famine and the world's largest refugee crisis. That's 3 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, for those of you keeping count. And the fighting is only getting worse. Just last week, the Sudanese military retook control of the capital, Khartoum, following an intense campaign against their rivals, the Rapid Support Forces. While a major victory, it suggests the military will now try and drive into the RSF stronghold of Darfur, an operation guaranteed to have a high body count. For now, though, we want to talk about other potential actions the military might take, because, flush with victory, they don't seem interested in stopping at Darfur. In a recent video message, the deputy commander of the Sudanese forces, Yasser al-Attah, effectively threatened the neighboring nations of Chad and South Sudan with war. In Chad's case, this is because the country has long allowed the Amjaras airbase, located near the border, to be used for smuggling massive amounts of weapons to the RSF. Supplied by the United Arab Emirates, for reasons we recently covered in a deep dive video, the weapons are the key reason the paramilitaries have been able to fight the Sudanese army for so long. So, you can sort of see Lieutenant General Attah's point when he calls the airbase a legitimate target. Unfortunately, there's a reason UAE chose Amjaras as its resupply point. There's no way the Sudanese military can attack it without risking war with Chad. The two countries have a history of bad blood going back at least 6 decades and routinely accuse one another of funding rebel groups on their territories. Chad complains that Islamist elements in Sudan support the Boko Haram insurgent group, for example, while it's well established that Khartoum funneled money to Chadian insurgents from 2006 to 2008. The risk now is that it could start doing the same again as a way to destabilize what it sees as a bad neighbor. As Central Africa analyst Charles Bussell told The New Arab, it would be counterproductive for the Sudanese army to enter into an open war against Chad, and it is more likely that the countries will fight each other through proxy groups. The same, however, might not be true of the other country Attah threatens, South Sudan. In the same broadcast, the Lieutenant General declared, "We will retaliate against the UAE for the corrupt client centers of influence in South Sudan." A part of Sudan since 2011, South Sudan already has a turbulent history with its old overlord. During the 2013 to 2018 South Sudanese civil war, Khartoum funded the armed opposition group SPLA-IO. In return, Juba allied with rebels in Sudan, such as SPLM North. Throughout the current Sudanese conflict, Juba has officially been neutral. But the Sudan War Monitor points out that, quote, reports emerged recently that it allowed fuel shipments to the RSF and the establishment of a UAE field hospital near the Sudanese border, which could treat wounded RSF fighters. In fact, Juba seems to be getting close enough to the RSF to get the paramilitaries to carry out its dirty work. RSF fighters recently crossed into South Sudan and attacked members of the opposition SPLA-IO, possibly at Juba's bidding. As the Sudan War Monitor writes, these events point to a growing proxy conflict between the two Sudans. As to why Juba would be interested in aligning itself with the RSF, well, for that we need to turn to our next brewing crisis, the civil war that seems about to erupt in South Sudan. Now, this segment's being written on Thursday, 27th of March, so by the time you see this, it's entirely possible that this brewing civil war will have become an actual civil war. Plenty of this in today's episode, isn't there? That's how fragile South Sudan is right now. As the top UN official in the nation warned last Monday, South Sudan is teetering on the edge of renewed civil war. For an in-depth look at the chaos pushing the world's youngest nation to the brink, you could check out last week's Situation Room, where it was our lead story. In this segment, though, we want to keep things short, although certainly not sweet. Because the chaos now engulfing South Sudan may be smaller scale than that affecting its northern neighbor, but it's equally brutal. When the 2013 to 2018 civil war ended, it was with a power-sharing agreement between President Kiir of the Dinka ethnic group and his vice president Riek Machar of the Nuer people. Fought mostly along ethnic lines, the war is thought to have killed 400,000 in a country of only 11.5 million. Recently, though, the shaky piece has begun to break down. Just as we were writing this, news came out that Machar had been arrested following a crazy month in which an armed Nuer group known as the White Army seized control of the city of Nasir in oil-rich Upper Nile state. In retaliation, the South Sudanese army, backed by Uganda, has indiscriminately firebombed the area, causing what the BBC called significant casualties and horrific injuries. Most of those hurt or killed in the bombings are Nuer. Combined with the arrest of Machar, the optics are of President Kiir and his Dinka moving against the group, perhaps even preparing an ethnic slaughter such as the one that accompanied the last civil war. As such, both sides now believe that they could be gearing up for an apocalyptic ethnic conflict. And as anyone who has ever read about the collapse of Yugoslavia will know, such beliefs have a way of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. As the UN's top official warned, renewed war, quote, will not only devastate South Sudan, but also affect the entire region. At worst, the carnage another round of fighting would unleash could see Sudan's civil war spill over into its southern neighbor. especially if the RSF and the Sudanese army decide to back their southern allies to the hilt. Speaking of proxy conflicts in which Uganda may or may not be involved, it's time to turn our attention away from Sudan and to another growing crisis, the M23 rebellion in eastern DRC. Blowing up in January, the crisis has seen a rebel group march on and quickly seize two of the region's biggest cities, Goma and Bukavu. Thousands have been killed, and while leaders keep talking about a ceasefire, so far the fighting doesn't seem to be stopping. Just last Tuesday, clashes erupted between M23 and pro-government troops in both North Kivu and South Kivu. The bigger picture, though, might be the outside actors supporting M23. The new humanitarian reports on UN claims that Uganda allows the rebels to use its territory as a rear base. But most believe that the bigger backer of M23 is neighbouring Rwanda. Nor is M23 the only rebel group Rwanda has been accused of funding. Neighbouring Burundi also accuses Kigali of funding the Red Tabara rebels on their soil, although the accusations go further than merely supporting an armed group. On Tuesday, the president of Burundi told the BBC that he'd seen credible intelligence that Rwanda was preparing to attack his nation. The wider context is the role the two nations are playing in DRC. While Rwanda backs M23, Burundian forces have been fighting alongside the armed forces of DR Congo. As Afrique 21 notes, relations between the two countries have been execrable for over a year now. But still, the idea that Kigali might invade its southern neighbour? It's one of those utterly mad stories that, had it happened 15 years ago, would have been leading the news every day for a week. Instead, it passed with barely a murmur from the wider world, lost beneath the constant churn of news and crisis that seems to have been rocking the globe for years now. Among that churn, the continuing instability afflicting the next region we want to talk about, the Horn of Africa. Of these, the biggest is likely the cluster of crises surrounding Ethiopia, which is currently in a state of civil war, maybe about to see a different former civil war restart, and is thought to be preparing for an armed conflict with one of its neighbours. First, the ongoing civil war. Since August of 2023, ethnic militia in Amhara region, known as Fano, have been rising up against the central government in Addis Ababa. Thanks to communications blackouts, it's hard to know exactly what's going on in the areas where fighting is fiercest, but reports keep filtering out of things like airstrikes on civilians and brutal ambushes. Just last Saturday, new clashes were reported, which both sides claim killed hundreds of their enemies. But while the Amhara rebellion is deadly, it has nothing on Ethiopia's last great civil war, the Tigray War. Running from 2020 to 2022, the conflict is still thought to be the deadliest fought entirely in the 21st century, with common estimates of the dead ranging from 600 to 800,000. Pitting the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, against the federal government in Addis Ababa, plus the government's Amharan and Eritrean allies, the conflict ended with a win for federal forces, but with the TPLF still in charge in Tigray region. As part of the peace agreement, then leader of Tigray, Debretsion Gebremichael, stepped down and was replaced by another TPLF member, Getachew Reda. But now a power struggle between the two men seems to be pointing towards renewed fighting in Tigray, this time between different TPLF factions. Indeed, Getachew recently fled for the safety of Addis Ababa, and there are fears that federal forces might be deployed to stop a takeover by Debretsion Gebremichael. Incredibly though, even all this is just a sideshow to what could be the real event: conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. As with most things in this section, this is something we've previously covered in much more depth, but as part of this overview of emerging horrors, we'll just quickly here sketch out the signs that these long-term rivals could soon start fighting. The main worry is that Eritrea, which currently occupies several districts of Tigray region, may be collaborating with elements of the TPLF leadership to strike at Ethiopia's government. At the same time, Addis Ababa has been making a lot of threatening noise about gaining access to the sea, and the quickest way to do that would be by launching a lightning incursion to seize the Eritrean port of Assab, a mere 70 kilometers from the country's shared border. Now, such tensions have been rumbling away between Addis Ababa and Asmara since the end of the Tigray War, where they briefly fought as allies. But it's all been supercharged by both the factional fighting in Tigray as well as maneuvering by both governments. On the one hand, Eritrea has started calling up reservists and issuing mobilization orders to the population. On the other, Ethiopia recently deployed tanks and troops to the border. The good news is that not everyone believes that war is inevitable. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED, recently assessed that, and we'll quote here, a direct confrontation between Ethiopia and Eritrea is unlikely despite the threat of military action in both countries. Although it must be said that the two leaders, Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia and Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, aren't doing much to calm the tensions down. The two promised on March the 21st to avoid war at all costs, while also saying that they cannot guarantee peace. Which, doesn't sound like something you'd say if you weren't expecting a conflict. Not that this is the only war in the Horn of Africa we should be worrying about. Just across the border in Somalia, the terror group Al-Shabaab seems to be on something of a roll. Here's how the Addis Standard summed it up. Al-Shabaab is no longer just a terror group launching sporadic attacks. It is capturing strategic towns, creeping ever closer to the capital, and shifting from an insurgency to a government in waiting. Combined with deteriorating relations between Somalia's constituent parts, between the capital Mogadishu and the regions of Puntland and Jubaland, as well as between Somaliland and everywhere else, the fear is that the Islamist group might make big strides, that a breakdown in the Somali state could see it even march on the capital. As the Standard writes, if Al-Shabaab marches into Mogadishu, the scenario will be eerily similar to the Taliban's takeover of Kabul in 2021. The Somali government could collapse overnight, and Al-Shabaab would declare itself the legitimate ruler of Somalia. And how likely that is to happen is something we can't say for certain. As with most of these stories from Eastern Africa, the danger scale could be anywhere from things are tense but stable to dear God, run for your lives. And that's really the point of this final segment, to show that instability is spreading throughout a vast region, with the potential for lots of smaller conflicts to feed into one another, perhaps eventually leading to a giant inferno. To be clear, the likelihood is that not all of these sparks will turn into wildfires. Some may just be bluff or bluster, and they fizzle away to nothing. But it's clear that things in this corner of Africa are more dangerous now than they have been in a long time, fueled by the ongoing crisis in Sudan, the tensions in the Horn of Africa, and the rebel advances in eastern DRC. We can only pray that none of it leads to eventual catastrophe. Thank you for watching.